The deadliest men in history are usually the quiet ones. The diplomatic carrier Aegis Dominion drifted above the fractured moon of Keros like a silver blade suspended in darkness. Beyond the reinforced observation windows, lightning storms crawled across the moon's frozen surface in slow, silent flashes. Inside the command hall, warm amber lights reflected against polished black steel, while representatives from 12 star systems gathered around the treaty platform. The air smelled faintly of machine oil, heated circuitry, and the expensive floral incense favored by the Virexian nobility. General Veolora Threx stood at the center of it all, tall and composed beneath the glowing holographic banners of the Helion Coalition. Her sapphire blue skin shimmered beneath the chamber lights, and the silver lines woven into her military uniform marked 30 years of command victories. Around her, senators whispered carefully measured words about peace, trade routes, and ceasefire zones. Veolora barely listened. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the tactical projections hovering above the table. Every instinct in her body hated ceremonies. Wars were honest. Politics were not. "General," one diplomat said nervously, adjusting his translation collar. "If Earth ratifies the Corridor Treaty, this sector could finally stabilize." Veolora gave a slow nod. Peace is merely the pause between mistakes. The room fell awkwardly silent. Across the chamber, a human quietly organized data tablets beside the refreshment station. Ethan Graves wore a simple black Aide uniform with no medals, no insignias, and no visible weapon. He looked older than most Earth officers. Early 40s perhaps, broad shoulders hidden beneath plain fabric. Short ash-brown hair touched faintly with gray near the temples. Calm gray eyes. Forgettable. Deliberately forgettable. He adjusted the treaty files with precise movements while steam curled from a cup of untouched coffee near his hand. Most of the alien staff barely acknowledged him. To them, he was simply the human administrative aide assigned to Veolora during the negotiations. Useful. Invisible. Safe. A young alien officer leaned toward Veolora with quiet amusement. "Your human assistant speaks less than a maintenance drone." Veolora didn't look away from the tactical map. "Then he is already more efficient than most officers." The officer chuckled softly. Ethan said nothing. Outside the massive windows, another streak of white lightning illuminated the moon below. Then the lights flickered once. Barely noticeable, but Ethan noticed. His eyes lifted toward the upper support beams lining the command dome. For the first time all evening, his expression changed. Not fear. Calculation. Somewhere deep inside the carrier, a warning tone pulsed once through the ventilation system. Too subtle for anyone else to catch. Ethan slowly placed his coffee cup down. Veolora finally glanced toward him. "Problem, Mr. Graves?" His voice remained calm. "Maybe." Before she could ask another question, the Western observation panel shattered outward in a violent burst of freezing vapor and silver dust. The room erupted into screams as security barriers activated half a second too late. A plasma round sliced through the chamber toward Veolora's position in a line of burning white light. Several guards lunged toward the general. None of them were fast enough. Ethan moved first. 1 second, he stood near the refreshment table. The next, he crossed nearly 20 feet of polished steel with terrifying precision. The sound wasn't dramatic. No roar. No heroic shout. Only the sharp hiss of displaced air and the metallic crack of something impacting far above the chamber ceiling. The plasma shot never reached Veolora. Silence crashed over the room harder than the explosion itself. Frost drifted slowly through the broken observation wall, while emergency alarms finally screamed awake in violent red pulses. Veolora stared forward, breathing hard. Ethan stood between her and the shattered window, one hand raised slightly, his black sleeve scorched near the wrist. Somewhere outside, far beyond the carrier hull, a distant object spun downward into the storm clouds below. A sniper nest. Neutralized. The nearest guards froze as they realized none of them had even seen the human move. Then an elderly admiral near the back of the chamber slowly went pale. His eyes locked onto Ethan's face with something far worse than surprise. Recognition. "No," the admiral whispered weakly. "That's impossible." Ethan lowered his hand and calmly adjusted the cuff of his burned sleeve. The old admiral's voice trembled. "The Reapers died 20 years ago." Ethan finally looked at him. Cold gray eyes. Empty in a way no peaceful man's eyes should ever be. Most of them did, he said quietly. The emergency sirens continued pulsing through the Aegis Dominion in slow waves of crimson light as armored security teams flooded the shattered command hall. Frost still clung to the polished floor near the broken observation wall, where freezing vacuum winds had briefly torn through the chamber moments earlier. Diplomats whispered nervously while medical drones hovered between scattered tables and overturned chairs, their soft blue scanners sweeping the room for injuries. General Veilora Threx ignored all of it. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the quiet human standing near the center of the hall. Ethan Graves looked strangely unaffected by the chaos around him. He calmly picked up the fallen treaty datapads one by one and stacked them neatly against the edge of the conference table as if assassination attempts were minor scheduling inconveniences. The burned fabric near his wrist had already darkened with soot, but he did not seem to notice. Two alien guards approached cautiously, hands hovering near their sidearms. Not because they planned to arrest him, because they were afraid not to. The elderly admiral from earlier slowly stepped forward through the red emergency lights. Admiral Sarek Vaughn had commanded coalition fleets longer than most officers in the room had been alive, yet his silver-scaled face looked 20 years older now. I watched your division disappear over Titan Station, he said quietly. No survivors. That was the official report. Ethan adjusted another datapad into alignment before answering. Official reports are usually written by politicians. Veilora crossed the chamber toward them, her boots striking the steel floor with controlled precision. Up close, she could finally see details she had somehow ignored. For weeks, the scars along Ethan's hands, the faint line near his jaw, the posture of someone who always positioned himself near exits without thinking about it. A survival habit. You withheld military history from Coalition Command, she said coldly. My record was sealed by Earth Defense Intelligence. Why? Ethan met her gaze for the first time since the attack. Because some wars are easier to forget than explain. Before Veilora could press further, a tactical officer rushed into the chamber carrying a glowing hollow tablet. General, we traced the sniper signal. It originated from a decommissioned mining platform approximately 18 miles below orbit. Veilora extended her hand for the report. Any faction markers? None, General. But the firing calculations were extremely advanced. The officer hesitated before adding. The shooter anticipated every standard coalition defensive maneuver. Silence settled briefly over the room. Then Ethan spoke from behind her. They were not aiming at your bodyguards. Veilora turned slightly. Explain. The sniper expected your guards to react first, Ethan said calmly. The shot was designed to hit you during evacuation movement. Several officers exchanged uneasy looks. The tactical officer frowned. How could you possibly know that? Ethan's expression never changed. Because that is exactly how I would have done it. The room went still again. Somewhere overhead, damaged metal groaned softly as repair drones sealed the shattered observation wall. Veilora studied the human carefully now, no longer seeing an invisible administrative aide. Every movement he made carried restraint. Discipline held tightly under the surface like pressure inside a reactor core. Dangerous because it was controlled. Admiral Sarek lowered his voice almost to a whisper. The Reapers were not soldiers, he said. They were what Earth sent when diplomacy failed. Several younger officers looked confused, but older veterans near the back of the chamber suddenly avoided eye contact with Ethan entirely. Veilora folded her arms. And now one of them organizes my meeting schedules. Mostly successfully, Ethan replied. To her surprise, a few. Nervous officers actually laughed. Very briefly. Then the ship trembled hard beneath their feet. The lights flickered once more. A second tactical alert illuminated the chamber in violent red symbols. Incoming vessels had just emerged from hyperspace beyond the moon's orbit. Ethan slowly looked toward the tactical display hovering above the chamber. His gray eyes hardened instantly. General, he said quietly, you need to leave this sector now. Veilora narrowed her eyes. That sounded less like advice and more like a warning. Ethan stared at the expanding fleet's signatures in silence for 2 long seconds. Then he finally answered. Because whoever sent that sniper, his voice became colder than the void outside the carrier hull, already knows I am here. The bridge lights dimmed as the incoming fleet's signatures expanded across the tactical display in sharp crimson circles. One ship became 5. 5 became 17. The command officers surrounding the holotable froze as identification codes failed to resolve across every incoming vessel. Outside the carrier windows, the fractured moon of Kairos glowed beneath streaks of electrical storms, while dark shapes silently emerged from hyperspace beyond orbit, like predators slipping through deep water. General Veilora Threx narrowed her eyes at the display. No faction markers. No diplomatic channels. No transponder signals. Her voice hardened. That is not a fleet. That is an execution squad. Around her, bridge personnel moved faster now. The smell of overheated circuitry spread through the chamber as communication officers scrambled to stabilize long-range scanners damaged during the earlier attack. Red warning symbols reflected across polished steel walls, while automated defense systems powered online one deck below. Through all of it, Ethan Graves stood perfectly still near the rear tactical console. Watching. Calculating. Veilora turned toward him sharply. You recognized them before our scanners did. Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the incoming ships. I recognized the formation pattern. From where? Earth. The silence that followed felt heavier than the alarms. Admiral. Sarek slowly lowered himself into the nearest command chair, as though his legs suddenly felt older than they had moments before. That attack formation was retired after the Orion conflict, he murmured. Nobody has used it in 20 years. Ethan finally looked away from the tactical display. Not nobody. A younger coalition officer stepped closer with visible frustration. You keep speaking in fragments, human. If you know something, say it plainly. Ethan studied the officer for a long moment. Not angry, not offended, just tired. There were 12 Reaper divisions during the war, he said quietly. Officially, all of them were dismantled after the armistice. Veilora folded her arms. Officially, Ethan nodded once. The problem with creating weapons is that eventually someone decides they are too useful to destroy. Another tremor rolled through the carrier. Somewhere deep inside the ship, heavy magnetic cannons rotated into firing position with a low metallic groan that vibrated through the floor beneath their boots. Tactical projections shifted rapidly as the unknown fleet entered weapons range. Veilora stepped beside Ethan near the central holo display. Up close, she noticed something strange. His breathing had changed. Slightly slower. Controlled. Like a man preparing himself for something unpleasant but familiar. You believe this fleet came for you, she said. No, Ethan replied softly. I know they did. Before she could respond, the main communication array suddenly activated with a violent burst of static. The chamber lights flickered once. Then a distorted human voice filled the bridge speakers. Attention Coalition Carrier Aegis Dominion. You are harboring classified Earth military property. Several officers exchanged confused looks. Veilora's expression darkened instantly. Property, not person. The voice continued through layers of interference. Surrender asset designation Reaper 7 immediately, and your vessel will be allowed safe withdrawal from Kairos orbit. Every eye on the bridge slowly turned toward Ethan. He closed his eyes briefly as though hearing an old nightmare return after many years of silence. Reaper 7, Veilora. Repeated quietly. Ethan opened his eyes again. Cold gray. Empty in a way that unsettled her more than anger would have. That was my designation. The communication officer looked horrified. Earth classified one of its own soldiers as an asset. Ethan gave a faint smile without humor. Among other things, the distorted voice returned louder this time. Failure to comply will result in full containment measures. Veilora stepped toward the central command platform. Her silver-lined cape shifted behind her as she straightened to full height beneath the crimson emergency lights. Transmit response. The bridge officer hesitated. General, Veilora's golden eyes never left the stars beyond the carrier windows. Tell them the Hellion Coalition does not surrender its people. For the first time since the alarms began, Ethan looked genuinely surprised. Just for a second. Small enough that nobody else noticed. But Veilora did. And somewhere far beyond the carrier hull, the unknown fleet slowly began powering its forward batteries. The Aegis Dominion shuddered as long-range cannons locked onto the approaching fleet. Deep mechanical vibrations rolled through the carrier deck beneath everyone's feet, like distant thunder trapped inside steel walls. Outside the bridge windows, dark enemy vessels spread into attack formation around the fractured moon of Keros, their cold blue engine trails cutting across the stars in perfect synchronization. General Veolora Threx stood at the center tactical platform while streams of holographic calculations rotated around her in glowing rings of red and gold. Defensive screens to maximum output, she ordered calmly. Prepare emergency jump coordinates toward coalition space. Around her, officers moved with controlled urgency. Nobody panicked, but the atmosphere had changed. Every glance drifting toward Ethan Graves carried the same silent question. What exactly had they allowed aboard this ship? Ethan remained near the rear tactical console, watching the incoming fleet with quiet focus. The emergency lights reflected faintly across the old scars along his hands. He looked less like a hunted man now and more like someone slowly recognizing a battlefield he thought he had left behind years ago. Admiral Sarek approached him carefully. They used your old designation publicly, the Admiral said in a low voice. That means they want the coalition frightened. Ethan gave a faint nod. Fear spreads faster than fleets. Then who are they really? Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the stars. Ghosts wearing Earth uniforms. Before Sarek could ask another question, the ship lurched violently sideways. Several officers grabbed nearby consoles as warning alarms erupted across the bridge. A bright stream of white energy flashed past the carrier windows close enough to illuminate the entire command deck for half a second. Enemy warning shot, the tactical officer shouted. They are targeting our jump stabilizers. Veolora's expression hardened instantly. They are trying to trap us in orbit. Another tremor shook the bridge. Somewhere below, the carrier's massive engines groaned under emergency strain while damage reports flooded tactical screens faster than crews could process them. Ethan suddenly stepped forward toward the central holo display. General, they are not preparing for a direct assault yet. Veolora glanced sharply toward him. How do you know? Ethan pointed toward the enemy fleet formation. See the spacing between the outer cruisers? They are funneling us. The tactical officer frowned as calculations updated across his screen. Then his face went pale. He is right. They are forcing us toward the moon's gravity well. Veolora narrowed her eyes. Why? Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Because they want close-range containment. The room fell quiet again. That word. Containment. Not destruction. Not negotiation. Something colder. Veolora stepped closer to him. You still have not explained why Earth would deploy an entire fleet for one former soldier. Ethan looked at the tactical projections for several long seconds before answering. Because the Reapers were never designed to retire. The carrier lights flickered again as another wave of interference rolled through the ship. Static crawled across the holographic displays. Then suddenly every screen on the bridge shifted to black. A single image appeared across all systems simultaneously. A dark military insignia. A black circular emblem marked with 7 silver lines. Ethan froze. For the first time since the attack began, actual emotion crossed his face. Not fear. Something worse. Memory. The distorted voice returned through the speakers. Calm. Human. Familiar. Reaper 7, it said softly. You abandoned your division 20 years ago. Did you really believe we would stop looking? Several officers exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan stared silently at the insignia glowing across the bridge screens. Veolora noticed something subtle then. His hands were trembling. Barely, but enough. Not from panic. From restraint. You know that voice, she said quietly. Ethan answered without looking away from the screen. Yes. The voice continued. The coalition does not understand what you are. But they will. Then the transmission ended. The insignia vanished. Normal tactical displays flickered back online across the bridge. Silence settled heavily over the command deck while distant alarms echoed through the carrier corridors. Veolora slowly turned toward Ethan. Who was that? Ethan finally exhaled through his nose. Tired. Cold. Haunted. The man who trained me. Outside the carrier windows, the enemy fleet began moving closer through the darkness around Keros' orbit. The carrier descended deeper into the shadow of Keros as the enemy fleet tightened its formation overhead. Outside the reinforced observation panels, the fractured moon looked almost alive beneath the crawling storms that wrapped around its frozen surface in bands of silver lightning. Every few seconds, distant flashes illuminated the dark hulls surrounding the Aegis Dominion like silent predators circling wounded prey. Inside the bridge, the temperature had dropped noticeably as damaged environmental systems struggled to compensate for the earlier breach. Officers worked beneath pulsing red emergency lights while the low hum of overloaded reactors vibrated through the steel deck plates. General Veolora Threx stood beside the central tactical display, studying possible escape vectors. There were none she liked. If we attempt a full jump now, the navigation officer warned, their interdiction field will tear our engines apart before transition completes. Veolora folded her arms tightly behind her back. Then we hold position until we create an opening. General, Admiral Sarek said quietly. With respect, those ships are not here for negotiation. Veolora glanced toward Ethan Graves near the rear observation window. He had barely spoken since the transmission ended. The reflection of Caro's lightning drifted across his gray eyes while distant engine vibrations echoed softly through the glass behind him. He looked less like a soldier now and more like a man standing too close to old ghosts. Mr. Graves, Veolora called calmly, walk with me. Several officers exchanged surprised looks as the general led the human away from the command center toward a quieter corridor near the carrier's inner observation deck. The doors sealed behind them with a hydraulic hiss, muting the bridge alarms into distant echoes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Beyond the long observation glass, stars drifted silently over the broken moon below. Veolora finally stopped beside the window. You are afraid. Ethan leaned lightly against the steel wall nearby. That obvious? Only to someone who has commanded frightened soldiers for 30 years. A faint smile touched his face for less than a second before disappearing again. Veolora studied him carefully. Without the tension of the bridge around them, she could see exhaustion hidden beneath his calm expression. Not physical exhaustion. Something older. The man on that transmission, she said quietly. You trusted him once. Ethan stared out at the stars. I trusted him more than my own father. The carrier trembled softly again beneath distant impacts somewhere along the outer shield perimeter. Ethan barely reacted. What changed? Veolora asked. Silence lingered between them. Then Ethan slowly rolled back the sleeve near his left wrist. A faded black mark rested against his skin just above the pulse line. 7 thin silver scars crossing a circular burn pattern. Veolora recognized military branding immediately. Her expression darkened. They marked you. All Reapers were marked, Ethan said quietly. It made identification easier after deployments. Deployments, Veolora repeated coldly. You speak about yourselves like equipment. Ethan lowered his sleeve calmly. That was the point. The words settled heavily in the dim corridor. Outside the observation glass, distant enemy ships glided silently across the stars. Veolora found herself staring at the old scar hidden beneath Ethan's cuff longer than she intended. For weeks, she had viewed him as background noise. A quiet human carrying schedules and reports through diplomatic meetings. Now every detail felt different. The way he always scanned exits. The way he never sat with his back exposed. The way his eyes measured rooms before entering them. Survival habits. Deep ones. Why become my aide? She finally asked. Ethan gave a tired breath through his nose. Because paperwork is quieter than war. Before she could answer, the corridor lights suddenly flickered hard. The entire carrier groaned violently beneath them as emergency sirens erupted again across every deck. A distorted voice crackled through the ship-wide communication grid. Warning. Unauthorized boarding signatures detected on lower engineering levels. Veolora's hand immediately moved toward the pulse sidearm at her hip. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Calm vanished. Something colder replaced it. Focus sharpened behind his gray eyes with terrifying speed. The human who organized diplomatic schedules disappeared in less than a heartbeat. How many boarding signatures? Ethan asked sharply. The automated voice responded through static. Unknown. Internal sensors are failing. Ethan stepped away from the observation glass. General, he said quietly, you need to stay behind security lines from this point forward. Veolora narrowed her golden eyes. That sounded suspiciously like an order. Ethan met her gaze fully for the first time since the crisis began. No, he said softly. That was concern. The carrier corridors echoed with overlapping alarms as armored security teams rushed toward the lower engineering decks. Red emergency lights pulsed across the walls in slow intervals, turning the polished steel passageways into rivers of moving crimson. Somewhere deep below, magnetic blast doors slammed shut one after another with heavy metallic booms that vibrated through the ship like distant thunder. General Valora Threx moved quickly through the corridor beside Ethan Graves while two coalition guards followed several steps behind. The air smelled faintly of coolant leaks and overheated wiring. Every few seconds the carrier trembled beneath another impact against the outer shield grid. Engineering reports internal signal disruption across 3 decks. One guard said urgently into his comm device. Visual confirmation is limited. Ethan's pace never slowed. They are cutting the carrier apart section by section, he said quietly. Valora glanced toward him. You sound very certain. Because this is not a boarding assault. His gray eyes tracked the corridor intersections automatically as they walked. It is a retrieval operation. The words settled heavily in the narrow hallway. Ahead of them, another blast door sealed with a hydraulic hiss, forcing the group to divert toward a maintenance corridor lined with exposed conduits and dim yellow service lights. The polished diplomatic sections of the carrier disappeared behind them. Here the ship felt colder, older, more honest. Steam drifted slowly from a damaged pipe near the ceiling, while distant warning tones echoed through the ventilation shafts overhead. Valora finally stopped walking near a junction overlooking the lower reactor chambers through reinforced glass panels. Blue reactor light flickered beneath them in slow pulses like a mechanical heartbeat. Enough, she said firmly. Ethan stopped beside her. You are going to explain exactly what a Reaper is. The two guards exchanged uncertain glances, but wisely remained silent. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the cold railing overlooking the reactor levels below. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he spoke quietly. Earth created the Reaper divisions during the final years of the Orion conflict. Officially, we were strategic infiltration units. Valora folded her arms. Unofficially, Ethan's expression remained distant. We ended wars before they could become wars. The reactor light reflected faintly across the old scar near his jaw. No negotiations. No recognition. No survivors left behind to continue fighting. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably. That is not military doctrine, he muttered. Ethan looked at him calmly. No, it is fear wearing a uniform. Silence followed. Even the hum of the reactor below seemed quieter for a moment. Valora studied him carefully. And your commander? Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Colonel Nathan Voss, the man from the transmission. He trained you. He built us. Before Valora could respond, the corridor lights suddenly failed. Darkness swallowed the passageway instantly except for the cold blue glow rising from the reactor chamber below. The guards immediately raised their pulse rifles. Somewhere ahead in the maintenance corridor came the faint sound of approaching footsteps. Slow. Measured. Ethan's entire posture changed. Not panic. Precision. His eyes narrowed slightly, while every muscle in his body seemed to settle into terrifying stillness. Turn off your weapon lights, he said quietly. One guard frowned. Why? Because if they can see you, Ethan's voice remained calm. They can predict you. The footsteps stopped somewhere beyond the darkness ahead. Silence pressed heavily through the corridor. Valora felt her pulse quicken despite herself. Then a calm human voice echoed softly from the shadows ahead. You always did prefer maintenance tunnels, Ethan. The guards immediately aimed into the darkness. Ethan did not move at all. Hello, Marcus. A figure slowly stepped forward beneath the weak emergency glow. Human. Tall. Broad shoulders beneath matte black tactical armor marked with the same circular insignia from the bridge transmission. 7 silver lines crossed the chest plate like claw marks. The newcomer removed his helmet slowly. Older than Ethan. Sharper around the eyes. Cold in a way that felt practiced. Colonel Voss was right, the man said softly. You really did attach yourself to another commanding officer. Valora's hand rested near her sidearm. Identify yourself. The stranger glanced toward her, briefly before returning his attention to Ethan. Captain Marcus Vale, Reaper Division 3. Then he smiled faintly. One of the dead ones. Ethan's expression never changed. But Valora noticed his hands again. Slight tremor near the fingertips. not fear. Restraint. Marcus took another slow step forward through the darkness. You should not have protected her, Ethan, he said quietly. Now they know you still care about people. The maintenance corridor felt smaller after Marcus' veil appeared from the darkness. The dim reactor glow beneath the glass floor panels painted the black armor of the former Reaper captain in cold blue light, while warning sirens echoed faintly through distant sections of the carrier. Steam drifted from damaged conduits overhead, softening the edges of the corridor until everything looked half real and half memory. Ethan Graves stood motionless between Marcus and General Veilora Threx. The two coalition guards kept their pulse rifles raised, but Veilora could already see uncertainty in their posture. Not because Marcus looked dangerous, because Ethan did not look surprised. Marcus rested his helmet beneath one arm casually, as if this meeting were an overdue conversation instead of an active military intrusion. His sharp gray eyes moved briefly toward the guards. Relax, he said calmly. If we intended to harm the general, you would never have heard us enter the ship. One guard tightened his grip on the rifle. Ethan spoke before the situation could worsen. Marcus. His voice remained low and controlled. You should not be here. Marcus gave a faint smile. You used to say that before every mission. Silence settled between them for a moment. Veilora watched Ethan carefully. The tension in his shoulders had changed. Less defensive now. More exhausted. As though each word dragged old memories behind it. You abandoned the division. Marcus continued quietly. Colonel Voss spent 20 years searching for you. Ethan stared at him without expression. I buried Reaper 7 on Titan Station. No, Marcus replied softly. You buried Ethan Graves. The reactor beneath the corridor pulsed brighter for a moment as the carrier engines shifted against another external impact. The floor vibrated lightly under their boots. Somewhere far above, distant defensive cannons thundered through the hull in slow mechanical bursts. Veilora finally stepped forward beside Ethan. You boarded my carrier illegally, she said coldly. Start explaining why your fleet is willing to risk interstellar conflict for one former operative. Marcus turned toward her politely. Because your aide is not a former operative, General. His expression darkened slightly. He is the last functional Reaper. The words seemed to lower the temperature in the corridor itself. One of the guards glanced uneasily toward Ethan. Marcus continued. The Orion conflict never truly ended. It only became quieter. Smaller wars. Hidden wars. The kind normal governments pretend do not exist. Ethan's jaw tightened. Enough. Marcus ignored him. Entire colonies stayed alive because Reaper divisions removed threats before diplomacy failed. Veilora narrowed her golden eyes. You speak about assassinations like public service. No, Marcus replied calmly. I speak about survival. Ethan suddenly stepped closer to Marcus, his voice lower now. You should leave before this becomes worse. Marcus studied him for several long seconds. You still think you can protect people by standing in front of danger alone? Ethan said nothing. Marcus looked past him toward Veilora. Do you know what happened during the Titan Purge, General? Ethan's voice sharpened instantly. Marcus. But Marcus continued anyway. 173 civilians trapped between orbital bombardments. Reaper 7 carried survivors through collapsing transit tunnels for 11 straight hours. Veilora glanced toward Ethan in surprise. Marcus smiled faintly without warmth. That part never made it into official records. Ethan looked away toward the reactor glow below the glass floor. Veilora noticed it immediately, the guilt in his silence. Marcus lowered his voice. You always hated what they turned us into. Because we stopped being human, Ethan answered quietly. For the first time since arriving, Marcus lost the faint edge of amusement in his face. The corridor fell, silent except for the distant groaning of damaged carrier systems around them. Then suddenly every emergency light in the passageway shifted from red to flashing white. A new alarm echoed through the ship. Critical breach detected on Deck 7. Reactor containment systems destabilizing. Marcus looked upward sharply. That is impossible. Ethan's eyes narrowed instantly. No, he said softly. It is bait. Veilora frowned. Bait for what? Ethan slowly turned toward the darkness deeper inside the maintenance corridors. His expression became frighteningly calm again. For me. Then somewhere beyond the next sealed blast door, heavy footsteps echoed through the carrier. More than one set this time. Slow. Deliberate. advancing toward them through the dark. The footsteps coming through the maintenance corridor were perfectly synchronized. Not rushed, not cautious, professional. The kind of movement that came from people who already knew exactly where everyone would be standing before they arrived. White emergency lights flashed across the narrow passageway, while steam curled slowly from damaged pipes overhead, turning the corridor into shifting layers of shadow and silver haze. Ethan Graves stood completely still beside the reactor glass railing. His gray eyes tracked the darkness ahead with quiet focus, while General Valora Threx rested one hand near the pulse sidearm at her hip. Captain Marcus Vale slowly lowered his helmet to the floor beside him. 3 signatures, he said calmly. Maybe 4. Ethan nodded once. Close-range containment team. One of the coalition guards swallowed nervously. You identify enemy formations by footsteps? Marcus glanced toward the young officer without mockery. You survive long enough, you start hearing intention. The footsteps stopped just beyond the sealed blast door ahead. Silence settled over the corridor again. Then a voice echoed softly through the metal passageway. Female. Human. Calm enough to feel dangerous. Reaper 7. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not fear. Recognition. The sealed blast door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a tall woman standing beneath the flashing emergency lights beyond. Matte. Black combat armor wrapped tightly around her frame, marked with the same circular insignia crossed by 7 silver lines. Her dark hair was tied close behind her head, and a long scar crossed the bridge of her nose like a pale crack through stone. She looked older than Ethan by a few years. Harder too. Lieutenant Sarah Cade, Marcus murmured quietly. Valora noticed something unsettling immediately. The newcomers carried no visible urgency. No anger. No aggression. Only certainty. Sarah stepped into the corridor slowly while 2 armored reapers remained behind her in the shadows beyond the door. You disappeared without authorization, she said to Ethan. Colonel Voss took that personally. Ethan's voice remained low. That was never my problem. Sarah studied him carefully. You still wear the same expression. A faint humorless smile touched her face. Like you are apologizing for surviving. Valora glanced between them. None of these people spoke like soldiers. They spoke like survivors of the same disaster. You destabilized my carrier, Valora said coldly. You endangered coalition personnel. Sarah finally looked toward the alien general. Her gray-green eyes were sharp, but not hostile. General Threx, with respect, your carrier became compromised the moment he boarded it. Ethan stepped slightly forward. Leave her out of this. Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. There it is. Marcus crossed his arms beside the reactor railing. He really does care. Ethan ignored him. What does Voss actually want? Sarah answered immediately. You. Silence pressed through the corridor except for the distant hum of the reactor beneath the glass floor. Ethan stared at her without emotion. For what purpose? Sarah looked away briefly toward the flashing emergency lights overhead. Another conflict is coming. Marcus added quietly. Worse than Orion. Valora narrowed her golden eyes. You expect me to believe Earth is preparing secret war divisions again? Sarah looked directly at her. No, General. Her voice lowered slightly. Earth never stopped. The words settled like ice through the corridor. Ethan's jaw tightened faintly. You should have let the divisions die. Sarah took another slow step forward. We tried. For the first time since the encounter began, actual sadness crossed her face. But the galaxy keeps creating monsters faster than diplomacy can bury them. Another violent tremor rolled through the carrier. The emergency lights flickered hard as a deep warning tone echoed across every deck simultaneously. Reactor instability had worsened. Marcus immediately looked toward Ethan. The containment field is collapsing. Ethan turned toward the reactor glow beneath the glass. His expression sharpened instantly. That is not system failure. Sarah nodded once. No. Ethan looked back at her slowly. Voss planted charges inside the reactor grid. Marcus exhaled softly through his nose. He is forcing your hand. Valora stepped closer beside Ethan. Can the reactor be stabilized? Ethan stared at the glowing containment levels racing downward across the nearby emergency monitor. Then he answered quietly. Yes. Valora looked at him. Then what is the problem? Ethan finally met her gaze again. The flashing white emergency lights reflected coldly in his tired gray eyes. The only person on board who knows how to stop it, He paused for one heavy second. Is me. The reactor alarms became deafening as containment levels continued dropping across every emergency monitor in the corridor. Blue-white lights surged upward beneath the reinforced glass floor panels in violent pulses now, bright enough to cast sharp shadows across the steel walls around them. The entire carrier groaned under unbearable strain while distant impacts from the enemy fleet echoed through the hull like slow hammer strikes against metal. Ethan Graves stared at the reactor readings for only 2 seconds before moving. Fast. Precise. Purpose replacing hesitation instantly. The stabilization chamber is 3 decks below this level, he said calmly. If the overload reaches critical mass, the entire carrier will collapse inward before emergency evacuation can launch. One of the coalition guards looked pale. How much time? Ethan glanced toward the flashing numbers. Maybe 7 minutes. Marcus Vale stepped forward immediately. Then we go together. Ethan shook his head once. No, Sarah Cade frowned. Ethan. He finally looked at the other Reapers fully. This was never about retrieval. Silence answered him because everyone already knew he was right. Colonel Voss had not come for reconciliation. He had forced a choice. Return willingly or watch innocent people die around him. Veilora stepped beside Ethan near the reactor railing. You are not going alone. Ethan's expression softened slightly for the first time since the attack began. Not much. Just enough to look human again instead of legendary. General, he said quietly, you command a coalition carrier carrying over 4,000 personnel. Another tremor rolled through the corridor. Emergency lights burst overhead in a shower of sparks farther down the passageway, while warning sirens shifted into a higher pitch. The reactor was getting worse. Ethan continued calmly. If the stabilization sequence fails, somebody needs to get the carrier clear of Caro's orbit before containment collapses completely. Veelora's golden eyes narrowed. That sounds suspiciously like a farewell speech. A faint breath escaped Ethan's nose. Almost a laugh. I was never very good at speeches. Marcus stepped closer. Ethan, listen to me. Voss engineered this because he knows exactly how you think. Ethan met his gaze. Yes. Then stop proving him right for once. The reactor pulsed brighter beneath them. Ethan looked down through the glass floor toward the unstable core glowing deep below the carrier decks. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Ethan quietly removed the black identification band from his wrist. The same simple band he had worn since boarding the carrier weeks earlier as nothing more than a diplomatic aid. He held it out toward Veilora. She looked down at it in confusion. What is this? My access clearance. Ethan's voice remained calm. Command level. It will bypass every sealed section between here and the bridge. Veilora did not take it immediately. Why give this to me? Ethan finally looked at her fully again. The flashing emergency lights reflected softly in his tired gray eyes. Because if I fail, he paused for one heavy second. You will need command authority to save everyone else. The corridor felt impossibly quiet despite the alarms screaming around them. Veilora slowly accepted the band from his hand. It felt surprisingly worn, like something carried for too many years. Ethan turned toward the lower maintenance lift leading deeper into the reactor levels. Sarah watched him carefully. You still believe saving people will fix what happened to us? Ethan rested one hand against the lift controls. No, he looked back at her calmly. But it helps me sleep sometimes. The lift doors opened behind him with a mechanical hiss. Reactor lights spilled across his face in cold blue reflections, while steam drifted through the corridor around his shoulders like smoke. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly. Not submission. Respect. Veilora stepped closer before the doors could close. Ethan. He stopped. You once asked why I chose to protect this carrier instead of surrendering you. Ethan remained silent. Veilora straightened to full height beneath the flashing white emergency lights. Because soldiers who still care about lives after war are rare. Her voice softened slightly. And I am tired of losing rare things. Something shifted behind Ethan's expression then. Small. Fragile. Human. The reactor trembled violently beneath them again, forcing the moment to pass. Ethan gave a slow nod. Keep the carrier steady for 5 minutes. Then he stepped backward into the lift. The doors sealed shut between them. Veilora stood motionless in the flashing corridor while the lift descended deeper into the failing reactor levels below. Around her, Alarms continued screaming across the dying carrier. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she realized something that unsettled her more than the enemy fleet surrounding Caro's orbit. The galaxy had feared Ethan Graves because he was a Reaper, but the truly terrifying thing about him was that after everything they turned him into, he still chose to save people anyway.